Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. Today on the pod, the kind of show I love. One of those single topic podcasts where we drill down on a question, let the conversation flow, and assume its own shape. I'll outline the question in a moment, but first our guest. My friend and heavy-hitting Canadian economy deep thinker, Don Drummond, joins us today. The Right Honourable Paul Martin called Don Drummond one of the most principled and imaginative public servants with whom I have ever worked. Don spent almost 23 years in senior positions in the Federal Department of Finance. Post-government, he was Chief Economist for the TD Bank. He's an Adjunct Professor at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University. And he's an in-demand thinker, writer, and commentator, and he's been gracious enough to be with us today. So, the question we're hoping to explore here is, with the fall economic statement as a backdrop, how can government address the political demand for affordability relief for Canadians? From programs like Pharmacare and school food, to Poilievre axing the tax, to Doug Ford cutting every Ontarian a check for $200, what is smart and what is dumb? So that's what we're going to get into. Don, so happy you're back with us on the pod.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, David.
Yeah. I haven't talked to you in a while. Are you ready for winter? Save up enough nuts?
I hate to confess it, but I'm about to go to Arizona, so that's my reply for the moment.
So you are prepared for winter. You're leaving.
And I just came back from Morocco, where it was very hot.
Right. What were you doing in Morocco?
Just a holiday thing.
Oh, okay. All right. So listen, here's what I want to talk to you about. There's tons of political pressure to deal with affordability out there. Right? It's been the number one issue in the country for several years. It's taking its toll on every government that's seeking re-election right now. So there's clearly some real political pressure on this. My opening question to you is there a commensurate policy imperative here? Is this a political thing that's whipped up, or is there a real policy need here that needs to be addressed?
I'm going to demonstrate two things right off the bat. First of all, why economics is a dismal science and why I'm not popular. No government in Canada has put themselves in a position to genuinely give a tax relief. And by that, I mean they're all up to deficits and debts beyond belief. And if you take the federal government, I mean, every month they've got a new guardrail, and as the roller coaster crashed through that guardrail, another one. The last one to bite the dust was we won't let the deficit go over $40 billion. We just saw the Parliamentary Budget Office say it's going to be well above that. We have large federal deficits. We got very high federal debt. Ditto for Ontario, ditto for British Columbia, ditto for Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. The list goes on and on and on. And governments don't have any money. I mean, you refer Doug Ford's going to cut everybody a $200 check. I'm sorry, but Doug Ford doesn't have any money. It's taxpayers' money. So he's going to give back taxpayers some of their own money, but they're going to pay for it. So that doesn't make any sense because Ontario's in a big deficit. So you can give and spend anything you want, but the one thing you can to save, somebody at some time pays for it. And you have some choices who pays for it. The wealthy could pay for it all. The poor could pay for it all. Mostly the decision is nobody today is going to pay for it. Somebody in the future is going to pay for it. But who's the hardest pressed in Canada right now? A young person. Who faces the highest unemployment rate? The onus is coming on young people. Who can't afford to buy $1 million house? Surprise, surprise, surprise. It's the young people. And that's going to come down on them. Just who's going to bear the brunt of the climate change? Both adaptation and mitigation, the young people. So it's just loading more and more. And you know, it sounds boring, but if you want to give a tax cut that's not just going to come back and bite somebody else, you have to be in reasonable fiscal shape, and nobody's done the work to be in that reasonable fiscal shape. So they're just piling on the money. To say you're going to give Ontarians $200 is just the height of cynicism. Ontario does not have the $200. They're giving back people their own money, which they're going to take back from them or their children subsequently.
Okay, well, that's pretty compelling. So they don't have the money to do it. If they did, or if they decided they don't care about your guardrails, is there a need? Are, for instance, family standards of living worse now than they were 5 years ago?
Well, let's put two things. First of all, the tax burden in Canada in general is quite high. Particular aspects of it are quite high. the so-called marginal tax rates on personal income are very high. By marginal, I mean not what you're paying on average, but if you earn one more dollar, what do you pay on that final dollar? And of course, everybody says, well, that highest burden's on the wealthiest. That's not actually true in Canada. The highest marginal tax rates are paid to low to middle income. And that's because of the very high tax back rates and things like the guaranteed income supplement and the child benefits. So people are in that $20,000 to $60,000 income range could easily pay back 80% and sometimes even more. So it squeezes their budget and it gives them no incentive to work, save, and invest. So that's a huge problem we need to address. Above a certain income level, you pay over half of your income. And governments keep raising that tax on those so-called high-income people. All that happens is they're going to earn less money. Why bother? I mean, do I want to do this work? It's going to pay me $10,000. I'm not even going to keep half of it. So that's a problem. We actually carved out, and you were part of the process. We began it in 1999 with the corporate income tax cuts in Canada. For a while, as governments followed through on that beginning, we actually created a pretty competitive corporate income tax environment in Canada. That has been frittered away, in part because other countries responded, particularly the United States responded. So we don't have that advantage. Actually, we're at a disadvantage on the corporate tax side. So that would be luck. But believe me, I'll come back to how you give the relief. That's not going to be near the top of any politician's list to give the tax break. Where we're low on the tax burden and where people want to drive it lower, the so-called consumption taxes. I mean, go to Europe. I mean, you're going to pay over 20% in a value-added tax. So we've got 5 at the federal, typically 8 or so at a provincial, around 13, and we have fairly minor excise tax and duty. So in Ontario, what did it first do when it wanted to reduce taxes? Well, it reduces the gasoline excise tax. That's where we're already low on the taxation relative to everybody's. Those are the taxes that have the least economic cost. So I say, first of all, no government has put themselves in a fiscal position to be able to do it. Secondly, there is a real need, but they never get at the need. And so what is $200 a person going to do? It's not going to do anything to affect the marginal rates. It's not going to do anything to give you or I or anybody else an incentive to work, save, and invest. Maybe it'll give you an incentive to buy something, but be careful because at some point you're going to have to pay the $200 back. The government didn't have it in the first place to give to you. And, this comes back to decades ago, the theory in economics that fiscal expansion like that shouldn't really have an economic effect because people are smart. They know that the dollar they get today is going to be taken back from them, particularly when governments are in deficit and debt. So you look at the inventory of what people have in mind. We've just been through elections in New Brunswick, and we're coming up to one in Saskatchewan and BC, and you look at what people are offering. It's cuts to the sales tax in Saskatchewan and New Brunswick. Well, we know study after study, for very good reasons, show that broad-based value-added taxes have the least economic damage. They don't eat into incentives to save, work, and the damage comes from personal income taxes, particularly in investment income and corporate income tax. But that's not in anybody's list. And then you give a flat tax return, that doesn't do anything. And even $200 relative to the budget squeeze. I'm not for the moment denying people are in budget squeeze. And this is going to continue because those people who are so fortunate to get 5-year 1.65% mortgages in 2021 and 22 are going to be renewing at 4 and 5%, even with the rate cuts. And that's going to really, really hurt them, and they're going to want relief. And then you look at the other thing. What is the big thing to help affordability in the housing side? Was the reintroduction of a 30-year mortgage amortization. Well, let's just think about that a moment. You're buying your first house at 30. Do you really want to sign up? You're going to have a mortgage until you're 60 years old? I mean, you have needs to be prepared for in your retirement years. You can't be running a net debt position when you're 60 years old. Why are governments offering this? And shouldn't we really be cautious, people? I get it. You're squeezed. You can't afford that house. But you do have to think about the future. You don't want to be indebted right through your entire working years. So my point is, isn't a house at least a forced savings mechanism for people who are generally not inclined to save for retirement? It is, in the sense that if you pay down your principal, but you're not paying down that much principal, particularly at the beginning on a 30 year, And people of our age and our parents' age took it as a given that you will have a real gain on your house price. That's not so clear. That hasn't been the case in the last couple of years. And given how high house prices are, that's not so clear that you can count on that going forward. So I think we have to be very careful. And I would say be careful about signing on to the third year. And if you ever do come across some money, do pay down that principal, because you don't want to be in debt for that long period. But my point is, there is a need, but when governments scratch that need, they tend to do it in an ineffective, inefficient way, in a so-called populist way. Like, you don't want to be cutting gasoline excise taxes, either for environmental or for economic reasons. You don't want to just give flat sums of money to people. They don't improve economic performance. And you definitely don't, if you're going to pick a tax to cut, you don't want to cut the sales tax. But of course, it's not just these provincial elections. Of course, back in 2006, that's what Harper did. And if you look at all the tax problems we had in Canada, a GST at 7% was not one of the problems. And so, and I guess my final point, to do anything meaningful, and I really put the emphasis on meaningful, is extraordinarily expensive. We have almost 30 million tax filers in Canada, so just let's do the math. You give them each $100, which is close to being meaningless. There's $3 billion. How do you do that when you're running deficits over $40 billion? Each point of the guaranteed the GST is almost $10 billion. Where do you come with the fiscal wherewithal? And in New Brunswick, they're deep structural deficits and debts. How do they come up with money like that? And I guess I'll finally just say, when we look to the future, the one thing we know for certain is we're going to have continuing expenditure pressures on healthcare. That's without even improving anything. We're going to have a doubling of the cohort 75 plus and a tripling of the cohort 85 plus, and that's where all the money is. Right. That's where the expenses rise. So we know that that's for certainty. And that's not even without talking about addressing the fundamental problems of 6 million Canadians not having a primary caregiver, people wanting to stay in their home but not having access to home care. So we got catch-up spending pressures and on top of all those demographic pressures. So I come back to, we haven't put ourselves in a fiscal position whereby we could do what would be a great thing to do to relieve the tax burden. And when we do try to relieve the tax burden, we do it in really silly ways that don't help economically.
With apologies to Rogers and Hammerstein and the nuns of Salzburg's Nonberg Abbey, I pose this question to all of you Herle Burly-ites. How do you solve a problem like copper theft? This is a serious and growing issue in Canada, and we'll be examining it for the next few weeks here. And while our presenting sponsor, TELUS, is delivering the message today, it's an industry-wide problem impacting all major carriers and the people and communities they serve. Some context. As costs for consumer goods continue to rise, more and more thieves are targeting copper wiring and other copper components, cutting it away from utility poles, substations, and construction sites. Then they resell it. According to the Canadian Telecommunications Association, the number of thefts grew by about 200% annually from 2021 to 2023. The data is revealing, but there are massive real-world impacts when wire is cut and your connection goes down. Emergency responders and public safety services go dark, so people can't call 911 to get the help they need. Imagine you're at home and a family member experiences a cardiac event. You pick up the phone, but there's no dial tone. You rush for your cell phone, but there's no service there either. There are other significant impacts. We can't do our jobs. We can't run our businesses. We can't complete assignments for school or access virtual medical care. TELUS can confirm that all of this is happening right now in communities across the country, and it results in expensive repairs to infrastructure, dangerous conditions for utility workers and the public, and opportunity costs for local economies. It's an ongoing risk to our communities that is entirely preventable. We'll dive further in next week, Herle Burly-ites, but before I sign off, know that a continuing theme here is going to be much stronger intervention and deterrence. Government working in collaboration with industry will be crucial to fixing the problem and safeguarding our essential services. Excellent. I want to address each of those silly ways in turn in detail, but first I want to just take a step back and talk to you a little bit about the psychology that's out there right now in the public and where this demand comes from. So, I mean, first of all, we hear that the American economy is going like gangbusters right now. But Americans are as sour about economic matters as Canadians are. Is there something going on in the lives of ordinary people that's not being captured by our usual metrics?
There is a phenomenon that occurred in 2021 and 2022 that led to much of this, and it's a very typical pattern. Wages lag inflation changes. In part, that's just if you might have just signed a 3-year contract for your wages. You don't get to open it until that 4th year. So inflation surged very dramatically and very suddenly when the pandemic hit. And so for a time, you had wages going up 2% or so, and you had inflation running up in double digits for a time period. Now it's the opposite way. Our last inflation rate was 1.6, and wages are going up 4%. And that's always the case. And we're seeing, particularly in the case of Ontario, where they tried to legislate the civil service at 111, the court threw that out, and they're getting catch up. So that is kind of evening itself out for a time period that really hurt. And then we have the reality and also the psychology of this interest rate increases. So sorry to keep referring to our age, and I will acknowledge I have a few more years on you. It's a very hard conversation with young people to explain to them that interest rates aren't high. And I get so angry every time I read in the newspapers interest rates are high. So then I become the when I was a boy kind of thing. My first mortgage was 17%. So if you want to talk about high interest rates, let's talk about my first mortgage in 1982. That was high. Our parents' generation, mortgage rates were legislated.
How old were you, by the way?
1982, I would have been 29.
There you go.
Making the big bucks at Finance Canada.
And buying a house.
But actually, you know what? From a personal household financial position, there couldn't have been a better thing to happen to me. My wife was working at the time, and we put every single cent we came across into paying down the principal, and we paid back that mortgage very quickly. Okay. When I say to somebody who's younger that's got one of these 1.65, you're typically allowed to pay 10 or 15% of the principal back annually without penalty. I say, why don't you do that? And they look at me, what the heck are you talking about? Why would I do that? I get their perspective, but my point is they're not always going to be 1.65. So now let's say you got a 5% mortgage, and everybody thinks that it's just so sky high, it's just absolutely devastating. Well, from a historical perspective for us older people, that's not a very high rate. That's a normal rate from a longer historical period. But I get the shock. If you're 30 years old, that's all you've known in your adult life. And you were given the Kool-Aid by a lot of people who told you wrongly. And I said it was wrong at the time. They're going to stay that low forever. Obviously,
and presumably, I don't know if you know this, but presumably when people buy a house, they buy the most house they can.
Well, I mean, and
so that when rates go up, that's holy shit. I can't afford that. Well, I don't have a buffer for that.
And that changed. Taste changed. So, I'm going down memory lane here far too often. But flash back to when I was 8 years old. Our street and all our neighbors and all my parents' friends lived in a bungalow that was 1,300 square feet, had 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. Does that exist today?
No.
There's no way. I mean, the norm is double that kind of size, so we've changed it. Just think about a car. Every single year, cars get bigger. And my car, I'm scandalized because my car is 2016. I'm averaging 9.2 liters per 100 kilometers. The efficiency gains of 2016 should mean that the replacement should be down in the low 7s. It's 9.2. No improvement over that time. Why? Bigger
vehicle,
heavier, more horsepower, more torque. Do I need any of these? What the hell do you do when you get to 100 kilometers after 4.2 seconds? You slam on the brakes. I mean, what's the point? But we do the same thing in housing. I mean, this comes to, I just said I came back from Morocco, and if you look at in cities like Casablanca and Marrakesh, you live in very dense population areas, a very small footprint. But we want to have the growth in the population, but we want the big lots and everything. And so our tastes have changed as well. And it's very interesting in Toronto, you're seeing the kickback against the 500 square foot condo.
Totally, that
And
market's
people are
fallen.
saying, that seems a little bit tight here. I don't really like that. But when it was all anybody could afford, they were quite popular. So again, we see the taste change, and what's affordable changes by the definition.
Right. To go back to the context for this fall economic statement and psychology. So we had a period of rapidly rising prices, and now inflation is down to its target rate, so prices have stabilized. After a few years of rapidly rising prices, how does price stabilization feel to a consumer?
Well, that comes back to the level. And this is one of the debates every 5 years when the Bank of Canada target gets renewed. There's always thrown in the hopper, should you target the price level or the change in the price? If you were going to target the price level, we would actually have to run deflation for many years right now. Right. So when we had that 10 to 12% inflation, that got baked into the price level. So maybe you were paying $3 for a dozen eggs before, and now you're paying $6 or more than that. It's not going back to the 3 or even 4. Maybe It's going to stay at the 6 and not go up much. But unless you're coming back to the wage side, unless your wages have adjusted to that, you have suffered a loss of your real income.
Okay, so hence the demand on the part of the public: give me some money. Give me some of my money.
Give me some of my own money back.
Give me some of my own money back. So we've been talking a bit about, well, first of all, how much are Canadians going to benefit from the fact that interest rates are dropping now? For my own reminiscence, I remember in finance in the 1990s, you folks used to say that interest rate reduction was the best tax cut.
It's very good. Let just keep in mind that not everybody's a debtor. And if you are fortunate enough to be in a net savings position, this is not good news. Oddly enough, almost all bond yields are right around 3%. So unless you have it in a tax-protected account, you're going to lose about 50% of that. That's 1.5%. Inflation is 2%, so you got a negative return. So for a lot of people, and we keep saying to everybody, you got to save for your retirement years or in your retirement years. That's not good for that. That's not good for that type of market. If you're a debtor, yeah, obviously this is great that they've come down. And the fear that 1.65% mortgage you snagged in 2021 was going to be renewed at 6 or 7% is not likely going to be realized because those bond yields have come down. It's going to be up a lot, but it's not going to be up that much. And I will give a shout out to Office of Superintendent of Financial Institutions, who, to the chagrin of virtually everybody, forced people to do the stress test when they had those mortgages at 1.65 and made them demonstrate they could fund a higher one. Right. That was brilliant. Look back in retrospect, that was really good. And one of the things I found was really interesting in the monetary policy report from the Bank of Canada yesterday is they estimate at the moment the household savings rate is 8%. It averaged 3% for the decade before that. It's up to 8%, and they speculate people are pre-saving, knowing the hit they're going to take from their mortgage renewal. Brilliant on the part of the households. I hope that's true. And it just shows the wisdom, and that does give me some confidence that we will get through this period. Albeit, if you got a savings rate of 8% and your mortgage payments are going to double, there's an awful lot of other things you might want or even need to buy that you're not going to buy.
Right. Some people have mortgages, but everybody has a credit card.
Well, and that's the saddest thing in the world. A lot of people have really high balances in their credit card, and there is other than your corner cash lender, paycheck lender. There is no other worse way of doing financing. You're paying the 20% plus rate on that, and lots of people leave that. And there's other ways you can do that. You can put in a home equity loan. You can get a personal loan. There's other ways of doing that, and that just speaks, I think, to the difficulty of financial literacy.
Right. I've told this joke before, but it's a pretty good one, so I'll tell it again. It originated in my part of the country. Anyway, a farmer returned home one afternoon and discovered that a flash hailstorm had destroyed his crop. Then he sees his farmhouse had been struck by lightning. And when he ventures inside the ruined home, he finds a farewell note from his wife, who's run off with the hired man. He stomps outside, furious, raises his eyes to heaven, shakes his fists, and yells, "God damn the railway!" It's a very old joke, with its origins in the days when the railways were almost monolithic economic forces in the lives of Western farmers. At the same time, fair's fair, and the railway gets to take some credit when it outperforms everyone's expectations, which is what happened last month. For the record, CN in September moved more than 2.81 million tons of grain from Western Canada. That total exceeded the previous record by 100,000 tons. And CN's railroaders accomplished that despite a grain workers' labor disruption in Vancouver and the closure of an important bridge in Thunder Bay. It means the various links in the supply chain meshed in September as they were meant to. It means CN trains kept leaving and arriving on time. It also means the grain farmers on our prairies are ahead of the game. A big chunk of their harvest has already arrived at its markets, domestic and foreign. This is nothing but a good thing. Onward. Okay, so let's talk about some policy options here. Let's say a government wanted to reduce taxes. And despite their fiscal position, let's take your fiscal concerns as written. You obviously stated earlier a preference for income tax as opposed to any other tax.
Yep.
Any other tax area. The problem with personal income tax cuts politically is A, that they're complicated, and B, because they're so damned expensive, the actual dollar amount ends up being pretty small.
Exactly. It was $3 billion for every $100.
Right.
$200, right. $6 billion. Yeah, and to do it properly, you want to change somebody's marginal income tax rate, and that makes it less than completely transparent who's looking necessarily at their marginal tax rate. But you don't want to do it in a lump sum, because lump sum doesn't improve saving, working, and investing. It just leads somebody to be able to buy something more.
Can you explain this marginal tax rate issue? What do you give me an example? What are you talking about?
Let's say you earn $50,000 a year. Now let's say you have an opportunity to earn $1,000 more, and you're deciding whether to do it. It's going to require some overtime work or something different. What are you going to get out of that $1,000? It's not on average what you're going to get. How much of that $1,000 are you going to keep? Well, if you're receiving the child tax benefit, you might actually keep precious little of that, because you're in a serious clawback rate on the child benefit you're getting. If that example doesn't work in guaranteed income supplement, but let's say you're $30,000, you might lose almost all of it because you're taxed back on the guaranteed income supplement. If you're earning at the top marginal tax break, you would lose typically in most provinces 55% of it. So you got to think, right? So I could do this extra work as some inconvenience to me. I'm not even going to keep half of it. Is it worth it? And that's why it comes to it's realistic. Are you creating a disincentive to work, save, and invest? Well, absolutely you are. And you think I gave this example of the 3% bond yield, you're actually getting a negative return in real after-tax terms. Well, maybe you should just party. Why bother saving? Let somebody else worry about your retirement. Be a burden on society. Why, I shouldn't tell tales against TD, but one of the things I discovered when I started working there was their investment advisors advised everybody to save regardless of income. And I had to point out to them, if your income on average over your lifetime is not more than $35,000, you're actually worse off if you save. You're actually better to receive the OAS and the GIS, because everything you earn on yourself will be clawed back. Now, you do want to save in the sense, because maybe you're not always going to be down 35,000. You're 30 years old. You don't know what's going to happen in your life, but that's the reality. But they had this knee-jerk reaction. You should always save. And that's not always the case. And it comes back to, I did the study showing that for a young single mother in Ontario, you were better off financially to be on welfare than you were to a job paying up to $3 above the minimum wage, because of the tax rolls and the benefits you get on welfare. So So these are the kind of harmful situations where these clawback rates, these tax back rates are very onerous on people and do drive changes in behavior.
Okay, well, but they're that way because the government's trying to deliver income support to people who really need it.
Yeah.
And not to people who don't.
And this is a classic comparison in the United States. So we tax back the child benefit at a very low income. The United States lets it run at the full level to over 100,000 to exactly avoid this problem. They're much less hung up about being criticized for giving some benefit, albeit a small one, to some at 90,000 than they are to create this. You were there. Remember how we got sunk by the mathematics of trying to income tax the old age security? Because in order to get a significant amount of money, you had to have a very steep tax back rate, and then you created this phenomenal disincentive to work, save, and invest. And we just kept going around and around and around, and it was inescapable. And we ended up at that time we ended up not doing it. It has come back in a different form since. But it's a tough math, because if you want to smooth that out, you have to let the benefit run out over a longer range, and
which is also very expensive to do.
Well, yeah, and so you look at coming back to the example of welfare. Now, Ontario changed this, but not that long ago. If you are on welfare, you get health and dental benefits. You get a job? No. Very few employers of low income would give that. So again, it was an example where you came off it. So the response to that is you could keep the health and dental for a period. So they're, again, trying to address that. In effect, that's a marginal tax issue as well. Yeah, so you would have to do something on the marginal tax rate. And as you said, it would be very expensive and it wouldn't necessarily be that transparent.
Or that large. Because are you actually telling me that to give people $1,000 on average would be $30 billion?
Yeah, absolutely. Almost doubling the federal deficit.
Right. Okay.
And yet we would still have pretty high tax rates for people, even though we did that. Good
to know. The GST seems to be the most politically attractive thing. You were talking earlier about
to cut.
Yeah. You talked about provinces cutting sales taxes. It's the same principle. It's visible. You can see the cut. It takes place immediately. It's completely transparent. Why is it off limits? Like, why?
Well,
Harper cut it. Everybody says this was a terrible thing to do. Nobody has raised it since. And what is, I understand it's not desirable. I understand that from a pure economic standpoint, it's less drag on the economy than income taxes are. But really, given its political impact, what would be so wrong with the government taking a point or two off of it?
Well, you gave the answer to that question, and you gave it in 1994. And here's what happened. So you came back from polling and focus groups and said everybody hates the GST. And I said, ask them to compare how much they hate the GST to the personal income tax. And you went out and rephrased the question. And it came back overwhelmingly, people preferred paying the GST to the personal income tax. And once again, it shows that people are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. They knew they didn't necessarily have to pay the GST because they didn't necessarily have to buy anything. And if they didn't buy something, they didn't pay it. They were smart enough to realize with a personal income tax, not only do they have to pay it on everything they earn, they have to pay it 2 or 3 times because they're fortunate enough to save any of their income. They pay the tax again on the savings. So there's double taxation on the personal income tax. So I've always said, and I just use that to illustrate it, it is not so obvious that cutting a sales tax is preferably politically than a personal income tax. There's one example where people
I think it is because of the I think it is, Don, because of the transparency. So in 2006, the Martin government ran on cutting personal income taxes, and Harper ran on cutting the GST. And similar to what you're saying, my polling right through the election campaign showed that people thought it was smarter to cut the personal income tax than to cut the GST. But they believed Harper was going to cut their taxes, right? And a personal income tax cut is completely obscure to people. Did it happen? Did it not happen? I don't see any impact from it in any real immediate way. So there's an intellectual thing, but in terms of political pop, are you giving me relief? It's easier to communicate the GST, I think.
Oh, absolutely. It's easier to adjudicate, but there is some value in doing the right things. Let's not forget that. But
I'm trying to get from you a sense of how wrong is the GST? Like, what's really the impact?
I'm averaging across many studies, but in general, we do studies. What is the cost of the economy of raising $1 of taxes? Okay. And a broad-based sales tax is around 20 cents for every dollar of a broad-based sales tax. You're talking about $1 economic loss for every dollar of personal income tax. You're talking about $1.50 to $2 for the investment portion. And you're talking anywhere from $4 to $6 loss of economic activity to collect corporate income taxes. I think you have to pay attention to that. Maybe this is
that sounds pretty compelling the way you put it there.
Well, I mean, I'm amazed we've made this far into a conversation with Don Drummond. The word productivity hasn't been raised, so let me raise it because I know you want to talk about it. I mean, we used to cry over our productivity only growing at less than 1% a year from 2000 to 2019. Now we look back, we don't only have that because it's been worse than that since. If you want to extrapolate what's the Canadian economy going to look like in 20 years, this is really, really troubling. And again, it's not just that we're in good company and everybody suffered. You were mentioning the United States economy. Their productivities continue to do just fine, thank you very much. Not only they continue to have a much higher level of productivity, but it's continuing to grow much faster. Somebody has to be worried about the longer term benefits of Canada, and you have to do something that's going to be pro-growth. You don't want to do something that's going to harm on the growth side, and we need to have a competitive personal and corporate income tax side if we're going to have that sustained long-term growth. And I know the whole thing you're going to tell me politicians don't get elected, what's going to happen in 10 or 20 years, but I do hope that somebody gives some thought to that. It's sort of like this. We are totally unprepared for this tripling of the 85 plus population, but we have known since 1950 it was coming, and we did nothing to prepare for it because it wasn't ever going to happen in anybody's 3-year window. But nonetheless, it was going to happen.
How come none of this matters to the United States, Don? I mean, I'm getting mad as I sit here and listen to you talk because I'm paying extraordinarily close attention to the U.S. presidential campaign. And I haven't heard either candidate mention the deficit one way or another.
And their deficit, or the debt are worse than ours. No, they're terrible.
Massive. I haven't heard anybody mention Social Security and the indebtedness there and the obligation going for it. They don't talk about any of those things, and they will cheerfully promise tax cuts despite their financial situation, and nobody even holds them to account on it.
Well, and the thing that's near and dearest to most households, you probably know, I know many people are in the $40,000 to $60,000 household income that pay $24,000 a year in health insurance premiums.
Right.
How in the world do you do that? And why is there not a revolt around that? And yet one of the candidates has proposed to replace Obamacare since 2014, and 10 years later, he confessed he has a concept of a plan. So but how's that acceptable?
But why don't the economic rules that apply to us apply to them?
Well, I mean, at some point that they do. The fact that they're the dominating economic economy and the fact that the world trades on their currencies are advantages. We clearly are in a secondary position. People don't need to invest in Canada. Unfortunately, they're not investing in Canada. They don't need to hold the Canadian dollar, and they're not holding the Canadian dollar. So I think that's a little bit different when you're a dominating economy than when you're a secondary economy. And coming back to productivity, when the OECD started with the 24 wealthiest countries in 1960, we had the third highest level of productivity. We're below the mid-range. So it's not just that other countries are passing us back. We don't have the performance of the United States. And in some sense, their superior level of productivity and their productivity growth allows them to carry the higher debt level. We don't have that.
The future of our forests depends on the steps we take today. Sustainably managing this natural resource will be essential to building the homes we need, diversifying our economy, and, of course, ensuring our forests remain forests for future generations. Here's how Canada's forest sector is helping. Canada is home to some of the strictest forestry regulations in the world and is recognized as a global leader in sustainably managing this renewable natural resource. Canadian foresters operating on public land, where 94% of Canada's forests are located, must submit a comprehensive forest management plan for approval by provincial governments before a single tree is harvested. All forests harvested on public land are also required by law to be regenerated, with Canadian foresters replanting 400 to 600 million seedlings every year. Our forestry sector knows that forests are essential to our environment, our economy, and our communities, and they take responsibility for their stewardship seriously. Our world is changing. It is essential that our government recognize one of the most powerful tools we have to change with it, our forests, and the sector that is working to keep them as forests forever. To learn more about what Canada's forest sector can do to help our forests adapt to a changing world, visit forestryforthefuture.ca. All right, back to tax cuts. The next Prime Minister of Canada's signature policy is to get rid of the consumer portion of the carbon tax. I actually want you to take your time with this question, because I'm not setting it up as a straw man to knock it out of the box. I mean, because I know that the standard argument is it will have no effect on affordability because people receive as much or more back than they do. But there are counter arguments to that. I know that there are distributional effects there. That isn't true of everywhere along the income scale. I know that there are probably regional effects there. It's not true probably in some parts of the country as it is in others. And the Parliamentary Budget Officer has said there are ancillary effects of the carbon consumer portion of the carbon tax that make the cost maybe greater in aggregate than people receive in the rebate. And I know that, for instance, the Premier of Newfoundland flat out doesn't believe its revenue, doesn't believe it is neutral in its impact on his residents. So, what would be the impact on affordability of scrapping the carbon tax?
Well, I don't need to take a second to think about that because the answer is obvious. Aside from some little rounding issues, is zero. Presumably, if you scrap the consumer portion of the carbon tax, you also scrap the rebates.
Right.
And as the government's demonstrated, and the Parliamentary Budget Officer said, on a static basis, and I'll come back to the static versus dynamic, but static without counting economic impacts, that's exactly what it is. And they've demonstrated. The Parliamentary Budget Office has done 3 studies on this now, and all shows, not you, it's you and me, because there's an income component. The wealthier don't get all the rebate back. The poor actually get more of it back. So mostly people, you won't pay $400 on the carbon tax, but you won't be getting your $400 rebate. So you're awash on that part. Presumably, if they get that back, I don't. And is that a winner? What you pay in the carbon tax is not very transparent either. Do you really even count it at the gas pump? But what you say embedded in a product you buy, you have no idea. So it's not very transparent what you're paying. I would actually argue in this case, the rebate is probably more transparent because you actually do get it into your bank account. You might get a letter to that effect. So I'm not sure why that's a great thing. I think we have to be cautious with that Parliamentary Budget Officer. They said that is on net, it doesn't all come back because it hurts economic performance. But in all 3 of their studies, they never even tried to capture the economic benefit of mitigating climate change. We know there's an economic damage to climate change, so obviously to the degree you mitigate it, and 8 to 14% of the emission reduction of all the weapons being thrown at climate change, 8 to 14% of the reduction comes from the consumer part of it. So it is performing a role, and the PBO made no efforts to estimate that. So that's why I say we're really talking about rounding to the cents. Grosso modo, that's in and out. It's out in and out economically. It's in and out on average across household budgets. Is that a big political winner that, you're not going to pay the portion of it when you buy gas or natural gas or consumer products, but you're also not going to get the rebate? You're going to be left unchanged, more or less. And you won't get that emissions reduction. And we're already, even with all the weapons, the attacking this problem, we're far from hitting the 2030 and 2050 targets. So now the gap's even bigger. And then the question comes, well, unless you're going to abandon those targets, something else has to replace it. And again, to date, there has never been a study that has found an alternative to the consumer carbon tax that has any less economic damage. All of them have much greater damage, but maybe they're not as transparent to people.
Don, I can tell you that the public will to fight climate change and reduce emissions has collapsed. And I don't think it's true just in Canada. I think it's true throughout the entire Western world. But in Canada, it is now the case, I believe, based on the research I'm doing, that if you propose an emissions reduction measure, it's not just a low priority for people. It's going to be greeted with some hostility because that has come to be seen to be beside the point somehow and not addressing what's really important.
No, I don't think that's it at all. I think the support is always there until you feel it. And as soon as you feel there's a cost, the support goes around.
Right.
I'll come back in the world of polling again. 1976, a poll in the United States. At the beginning, it asked, are you willing to pay higher taxes to protect the environment? Almost 100% said yes. Later in the same poll, same people answering and said, are you willing to pay $10 higher taxes a year to protect the environment? Everybody said no. So the value of protecting the environment was somewhere between 1 cent and $9.99. And that's what we're living. We've been living that ever since. The carbon tax was fine until it got to a significant level. And then people are told what it's costing percent, and now they're objecting to it. So it's all fine. Do anything you want as long as it doesn't affect me. And as long as I don't see it. And so I think that it was sad, but that was inevitable to support. And I don't think it's because of difficulty of accessing primary care. It's just that we feel it now. And we thought we would tackle this without ever affecting us.
Right. No, that's right. People don't feel the need to sacrifice for this. And it has come to be seen as a clear sacrifice. The attempts to argue that economic growth and economic prosperity and emissions reduction go hand in hand, that argument seemingly has failed.
And yet, at the same time, people must see the evidence of the cost. BC is either being flooded or on fire, and some places one after the other. That's real. Good parts of Alberta have been that. We've seen the flooding in many other parts. If you
don't want to believe it, Don, you look at it and you say it's arsonists and bad forest management.
Yeah, at some point you got to pay attention to the predominance of the science, and you look at just the trends we're seeing in the tropical storms hitting. I mean, basically, where can you live in Florida? This is a state of millions of people all threatened by climate change for the last number of years. And does that not worry somebody? I have a place in Arizona. There's no water there. That's it, basically. Right. Look at the Colorado River. It's just going down. You look at the calcium deposits. You can see the levels of the reservoirs going down every year. That got to worry. But again, it comes back to this time issue. Again, they survived the last hurricane. Wasn't as bad as anticipated, and we'll take another one. But the trends are there. But you're not going to get people willing to sacrifice for the future. That's the problem. Can somebody convince them they need to do that? I hope so.
Martin Sheen and Aaron Sorkin. Right. So back to affordability. The Trudeau government's gone at this a completely different way. They're not reducing taxes anymore. They ran in 2015, capitalizing on a similar sentiment. They ran on a middle-class tax cut and delivered one in 2015. But now they don't talk about tax cuts. Now they talk about programming. So they're bringing in targeted Pharmacare, targeted dental care programs, child care subsidies, school food programs, all targeted generally at the lower end of the income spectrum. How do you feel about that approach to addressing people's cost of living crunch right now?
I feel it's messy vis-a-vis our Constitution because virtually everything they're doing is in a provincial domain. Fine if there's agreement, but I think we're just bound to have friction. It's not just going to be Quebec says, just give me the check and get out of our life. And there's a legitimacy to that issue. That's the way it was written. The federal government is supposed to look after defense and some other things. They're not supposed to be looking after child care and long-term care, and they're not supposed to be setting the standards for long-term care institutions. If we want to come together and set national programs and national regulations for that, that's fine and that's great, but that's not the direction we're going. So it's checkbook federalism. And I think, we did that in the 70s and 80s, and that episode ended rather badly. And I think this will as well. That's not to deny there's a need, but it's not the federal
Are these
government.
addressing real needs? Are these smart things to do? Are these going to help people?
I don't think in general the direction of the Pharmacare is the way to go. We have people like me, perhaps you, that for better or worse, and maybe largely for worse rather than better, we do have private plans that we've been paying in for a long time and we're more or less covered. And yes, we could probably get it cheaper, but that's not a burning need. And if you replace my private plan with a public plan, I may be concerned I'll be worse off. So why bother me? Right. And a lot of people in that position, and of course, there's a lot. I mean, the Quebec plan is quite reasonable, I think. It basically says if you don't have private coverage, you have to take a public coverage, and here's how it's offered. I don't see what's wrong with that. It's in Hoskins' terms, it was the big bang versus fill a gap. I think there's a scope to do the fill in the gap, and we should be working much more to bring down the price of drugs. We have amongst the highest priced drugs in the world, and we could be doing something about that. So there's different ways that we could do that. I think the number one problem right now is just almost the 6 million people that don't have regular access to a primary caregiver, and there's limits to what the federal government can do about that. We're seeing some provincial action, but that's where it surprises me, because you know better than anybody else. Issues like environment rise and fall on concern lists, but healthcare is always the number one issue and the number one concern, and always shall be. And there's very good reasons for that. So how do you take a number one concern and not have a political revolution on our way right now, when you can't see anybody or you have to wait and you're in serious difficulty and you see governments not doing very much about it? I don't get that. I really marveled 2021 election in Nova Scotia, because I thought that's the way it would work. That was basically a single issue election, and the platforms of all three major parties were focused on that. I would say subjectively, the party that had the most comprehensive plan for primary care access was the one that won. And I thought it was very telling. The very first thing they did on taking office is they created these walk-in clinics led by nurse practitioners and pharmacies. And I thought, well, that's the way that this should go. Why is that not going? The public spoke. There was 68,000 people in the province who didn't have primary care cover, and that was on the front page of every newspaper and every newscast right through that election. It just inundated people with it, that was the singular issue. Governments responded and they actually did something about it. And then they did that, reducing the paperwork, administrative burden for doctors, knocked that down about 30%. So it's just, when the people get riled up enough and they speak loud enough, something gets done. But why are people not screaming louder, and why are governments not acting more forcefully about this really serious problem? But again, that comes back to this smugness in Canada. Well, we still got it better than the Americans. That's only true to some degree. If you've got a decent employer in the United States, you're covered very well. And under Obamacare, a lot of the people that aren't covered by employers do get some coverage, and they don't typically face the wait times that we do. But we have to stop comparing ourselves. The Northern European countries.
But there's a financial component for almost everybody, Don, right? Like, even if you're covered by insurance, and I've only learned this in the last number of years from friends in the United States, you have a copay generally.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So if you have a costly surgery, it's going to be thousands and thousands of dollars for you, even if you have a good plan.
Yep. Well, right? I was when I decided to throw myself headfirst down a staircase at Molokai in 2019 and fractured my neck. That the bill in the United States for that was $100,000, and I never received any treatment. The neck just fused itself. And imagine what the cost of that would have been if there'd actually been some treatment behind that. $100,000 just over a couple of days.
Right. But I think, to your point, I think healthcare is the biggest issue in the country right now at the provincial level. And I think that the weirdness of our politics right now is that the Prime Minister is sucking up so much of the negative energy around politics that the premiers are getting off generally a bit lightly. But when they're hitting the electorate, you can see what's happening.
Well, but I mean, politics is your realm, but not mine. But you've opened the door. So if I was thinking politically, what does the public most want? Better access to healthcare or a tax cut? And let's for a moment look globally. Let's look at the indexes of happiness. Who are the happiest people in the world? The Northern European economies. They got high taxes, but they got access. They're all registered with a primary caregiver. They got good access to education, and they don't seem to mind paying the taxes. And they pay a really large portion of it through value-added taxes, not through the income taxes.
But if I'm Justin Trudeau or Doug Ford, my question is, what can I do in the next 6 months? Right? You can't solve the access to healthcare problem in the next 6 months.
I'm not sure you have to solve it, but you should be seen to be doing more about it than you are. And of course, now Doug Ford's appointed Jane Philpott to look at that. She said she's going to have the report. I don't know. I would be very worried if I were her that he's not going to listen to her, but because we do have other priorities like $1 a beer can and stuff like that. So you got to be mindful of that.
Well, he has to be mindful that she not the type of person that goes quietly, apparently.
Good for her.
Hey, there's a fall economic statement coming up. Do you have any idea what's going to be in it? What do you think should be in it?
Well, really high deficits, and only modest improvement to them, and a lot of hand waving that all's fine, and there's no problem with that. What else can you do? No.
You're not expecting measures?
The funny thing about that is that, the president of the Treasury Board was charged with doing this program review and gave a very brief report on the first phase of it and said there'd be a more complete report on the second phase. You ever seen it?
No.
It never came.
No.
There's a press release that says the results by department are embedded in the departmental reports. So if you actually wanted to know what happened, you would have to read dozens of departmental reports over hundreds of pages. So obviously there was the desire. I
guess they're not as proud of their program review as we were of ours.
I guess not much got uncovered. I don't know. Does that sound like it is an abject failure? So, but that does raise an interesting issue for if there were a conservative government, for the sake of argument. Presumably, they would want to stake out a clearer path to lower deficits and debt. But would they do an expenditure reduction round? As we all know, it's a lot easier to talk about it than actually do it. As I said, the one reality you can never escape is every dollar a government spends goes to somebody for something.
Yep.
And I may think the dollar that goes to you is a waste of money, but you probably similar think the dollar that goes to me is a waste of money. So neither one of us is going to be happy. And it's hard when you've ramped up the spending.
It's going to be very difficult to do anything serious on the deficit, Don, because nobody gives a shit about it. Not nobody. Yeah. There's a 30% slice of the population that cares about it consistently. But at the levels that it's at right now, and with the debate where it's at right now, the other 70% prioritize almost anything else over top of it.
Yeah, well, I guess I have to wait till the crisis and then bring you and I back to fix it.
There you go.
But better do it soon, Norm.
Hey, a light question to end on, but an interesting question, I think, which is, people think now the current conventional wisdom is that the government may be able to limp its way to a budget in the spring, maybe involving prorogation, may be able to limp its way to a budget in the spring to deliver a budget, but not pass it. Mm-hmm. That would be the end of the House. The government would fall on the budget and we'd be into an election. Have you ever worked on a budget that you knew would not come into law?
No, I haven't. No.
What do you think it would be like to be in the Department of Finance and spend all that time over the next number of months writing a budget that was effectively a pro forma exercise?
I got to tell you, if somebody in my mindset would already be very discouraged. because I wouldn't have wanted to participate in the budgets we've had for now. And this is not a partisan comment. I didn't like the conservative budgets either. I thought that the lack of fiscal discipline got set in a long time ago. And as you said, I never would have wanted to preside over a tax cut. I never would have liked the GST. So I wouldn't have been happy working on the budgets for a long time. But absolutely, that'd be very discouraging. But, but it's not just that aggregate stuff. It's the more minor stuff. I come back to it. And maybe it doesn't seem like a big deal, but I am still reeling by the way that the increase in the capital gains inclusion rate was handled. It's almost like it was done deliberately to hurt people. And I don't know if I could have stomached working on something like that. Like, if you want to increase the capital gains inclusion rate, fine. I can argue all kinds of reasons why it shouldn't be included, but if you want to increase it, but why announce with a couple of weeks to go that it's going to be effective? Like, I get you had to make it fairly soon because you clearly had to bring in billions of dollars and you had to force a disposition of assets. First of all, I could never have stomached working on something that forced people to dispose assets for tax reasons. That goes against every economic tax principle. But why did you pick June 24th as the date? They could have picked any date in the calendar year. Like, it's fine if I've got a public share, I can sell it within a couple of weeks, but maybe I've got my money in a private interest. You can't do that. I can't sell real property. I can't get out of a private partnership on a couple. That just hurts people. For what purpose? It almost seemed like they wanted people to complain, and that's the rich person just complaining. But, we also come back to that longer term growth stuff. We need more investment. We need more venture capital. I'm sorry, but people at low income aren't the ones that are providing that. And because we don't allow inflation protection on your capital gains and we don't allow forward loss ability, we should have a low inclusion rate on the capital gains. So that kind of stuff, it's not just the overall tone or whether the budget would pass, but some of those measures would have really, really bothered me in the way that they were communicated as well.
Yeah.
But that's just another story about when I was young, everything was great. I always... he might not have originated it, but it always comes back to my mind. The former clerk of the Privy Council office, Mel Kapp, says there's no such thing as the good old days, just people with bad memories.
Yeah, Ken Dryden has a similar formulation. He says things aren't as good as they used to be, and they never were.
Yeah, that's yeah, that's right. Turns out he didn't have a shutout every game he played for the Canadians.
Exactly. Don, this was awesome. Thanks for visiting with me. It's always great to catch up with you.
I see Jean Belleville behind you.
Yeah, oh yeah. It's hockey season, man. Go Habs, go.
Okay, David, you're welcome.
Take care, brother. I would like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsors, CN and Forestry for a Better Future. I'd like to thank all of you Herle Burly-ites who watched and listened, and a special thanks to my old friend and mentor, Don Drummond. See you next week with more of the Herle Burly. Take care of yourselves.